everyone. I'm so proud to announce and host the first ever Her Story in the Making, presented by Women of Fantasy Football, powered by Fantasy Alarm in the most epic partnership. And for my first ever guest tonight, we have the co-founder of Women of Fantasy Football, Faith Enes. Faith, thank you so much for coming on. And how are you doing?
Britt, thanks for having me. I am fantastic. Life is finally starting to slow down, so I can
Always a
breathe.
good thing. Always a good thing. Well, thank you so much for taking your time out of your busy schedule and coming on with us. This has been such an amazing opportunity, and I'm really excited to feature several up and coming women content creators in the space. But you are a fellow SEC girl and Georgia fan. Hogs and dogs on the show tonight.
Yes, hogs and dogs.
Hogs and dogs.
It's also like the perfect barbecue food: pulled pork and hot dogs. Hogs and dogs.
You make a very
Somewhere
valid
Josh
point
Hudson
there.
is laughing hysterically at me for that line.
I love it. I love it so much. Um, so I'm just going to kind of start off here. For those of you out there who don't know Faith, just tell us a little bit how you got into sports and football and fantasy football specifically.
So I got into sports because of my dad. So my dad was born and raised in Connecticut. He moved to Florida when he was 25. So in New England, college football is not really a thing, but I grew up rooting for the New England sports teams. The Patriots, the Red Sox, the Bruins. We didn't really have a college football kind of team because it's New England. And if anything, they pay more attention to like college basketball up there because it's usually cold and snowing this time of year. So for some reason, we never had a team to root for, but I always grew up rooting against the University of Florida. Don't know why. Don't know how that happened. But I've been a Gator hater since I can remember. And then my parents moved to Georgia about 15 years ago. And Georgia, big in the SEC. And full disclosure, I thought UGA was adorable. So I decided to become a UGA fan 15 years ago. And that's how that stuck. My foray into fantasy football is a funny story. So I was in a sports group on Facebook that Josh Hudson also happened to be in. Shout out Josh Hudson. And there was one Saturday morning that they were doing a live fantasy football draft. I had never played fantasy football, but the live draft had $100 buy-in. And I was like, there's no way I am spending $100 on something. I have no idea what I'm doing. I'm not a gambler. I went to Vegas this past summer and didn't gamble a single penny. So I was like, there's no way I'm going to spend $100 on something that I don't know what to do. But I showed up anyway, just to socialize as the social butterfly that I am, and ended up filling a spot for somebody who paid but didn't show up. So I end up sitting next to Josh at this table, and I'm like, I have no idea what I'm doing. And he goes, we can fix that. And I said, okay. So Josh and I got connected, and he is also a screenwriter, for those of you who don't know. And so I said to him, I was like, hey, if you need an editor, let me know, because that's one of my passions, and it always helps to have somebody edit your work, which then translated into, hey, I have a fantasy football article. Would you mind looking at it and editing it? And I was like, yeah, sure, no problem. So editing fantasy football led to me playing fantasy football. The first year that I was kind of editing for Club Fantasy, I think I was in 3 fantasy football leagues. The following year, I was in 13. As most fantasy football degenerates do, they go from like 2 to 22.
Yeah,
thankfully,
exactly.
like 13 was hard enough. There's no way I could do 22. So that is, I grew up with sports, and then I grew into fantasy football.
I love that too, because it does seem like such a natural transition when you are such a fan of the sport and you already have so much knowledge about it. It seems like taking the step into both playing and then contributing content for that sport is the next logical step. So, yeah, that's super cool. And I was going to ask you, when did you realize that you wanted to branch out from a fan to creator? But it seems like that was kind of already written in the cards, like with Josh there asking you if you wanted to edit, because I know that you're a great editor, super, super just detail oriented. And I really admire your editing skills because as an ADD person who's just like, yeah, this is fine. Like, I really admire a very thorough editor. So, but when did that moment actually start? Just from going from, hey, I'm just going to edit this one thing to, hey, I want to be involved in several aspects of this industry?
So I would say I was editing here and there for Club Fantasy FFL articles. So for Josh, for our good friend Joe, I was just editing a handful of articles there. And that was kind of before Josh decided to double down with Club Fantasy and like focus on doing all of that stuff. And so I kind of feel like me and Club Fantasy kind of grew together for a hot minute because we kind of grew into that focus on the community and all that stuff. And so it was around March of 2021 that somebody in the community who knew I was an editor reached out to me and said, hey, I'm working with the IDP guys on their rookie magazines, and the editor for the project had to step back. Would you be interested? And I said, sure, why not? So I got in contact with Nate from IDP guys, and he's like, here's all the stuff, here's all the details, here's XYZ. And I was like, okay, cool. And so when I finished that, Nate said, the editor on this project was also the lead editor for the website. How would you feel about stepping in as lead editor at IDP guys? And I was like, okay, sure. So I would say it really started as me. I was in the community just like here and there. I'd say I was kind of watching from the sidelines until March of last year when I kind of just jumped in with both feet, and I was like, okay. And then it was several months later in 2020, probably around June, when Josh came to me and said, hey, I have this idea, because that was right around the time that Bobby Sylvester happened and women, the whole start of women just being dogged in the fantasy community because we don't know what we're talking about, blah, 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 blah,
We
blah.
never played the sport.
No,
How do we know what we're talking about?
Exactly. Neither have you. Shut up. Anyway, so he's like, I have this idea. I want to shine a light on the women of fantasy football, but not just them in fantasy football, but them as women and as people. And so I was like, okay, great. When do you want to do this? Again, this was June. And he goes, well, we have 4 weeks before the season starts. So like August, September. And I was like, that's like, he's like, yeah, you can do that, right? And I was like, sure. Full disclosure, I did, but that's neither here nor there. So 2020 was the pivotal year in my life in the fantasy football community.
And you've completely crushed it. I would never think in a million years that you had just started out in 2020, because you're so natural as a host. You're so natural as an editor and as a speaker. But are there any challenges that you faced either on or off camera, especially as a woman in a primarily male-dominated industry?
So as far as I'm all over the place. So I would say that I don't know that I necessarily get as much hate or vitriol as some of the other women, because the work that I do is mostly either behind the scenes or is more of a host type of deal. I don't quote unquote make content. I don't post stats. I write one article every year. This year I wrote 2, so that's saying something. But for the most part, I don't write. So I'm not constantly saying Justin Jefferson is going to do XYZ, and then when he fails, oh, you don't know what you're talking about. So I think in that aspect, I'm kind of removed from that. and it's not that I hate to say this, but I don't think that I have ever gotten any male grief for my place here. I've gotten male grief for other things, but not for my place in the fantasy football community, which is great. But I also know that it's not the experience for most people. Like Lauren Carpenter. Lauren Carpenter is a good friend of mine. She's a badass. She knows her football. But yet you can hop on her Fireside Friday every week and there's at least one person telling her she doesn't know what she's talking about. Lauren knows more about football than most of the men that I know. I mean, so it's just ridiculous.
It's a very, I think, strange dynamic, but you and Josh and everybody over at Club Fantasy and Women of Fantasy Football are doing a huge service to the industry by bringing these women in the industry to the forefront, bringing their knowledge to a space that otherwise might not have considered them. So tell us a little bit more about the founding of Women of Fantasy Football and what your initial mission was, how many people you've brought on, how it's helped in the space, how it's your baby. Just give me all the deets on Women of Fantasy Football.
Okay, so like I said, in like June of 2020, Bobby Sylvester, him and a slew of people, just their disgusting words, comments, actions towards women in football, in sports in general. It was just enough. And then Josh came to me. Josh, if you don't know Josh Hudson is A, the founder of Club Fantasy FFL, B, co-founder and the idea man behind Women of Fantasy Football, and C, he's just a really good person and one of my greatest friends. He's the older brother that I never had, so I annoy him like a younger sister would, and he loves it. He probably just won't admit that. That's just a little sidebar. So he came to me and said, I want to do this. And I was like, okay, great. What are you looking at? And he's like, August. And I was like, okay. So I also work for the elections office. 2020 was a presidential election year. So I had 2 elections in the fall, plus trying to deal with conducting 2 elections in the midst of a global pandemic, plus trying to find guests and figure out a lineup for 4 weeks of shows starting in 2 months. So there was a logistical nightmare happening in my head. And we found our guests. We found our first year was names that you probably recognize. We had Casey Kasem. We had Sam Holt. We had Kate and Michelle Majuk. We had, it was the podcast debut of Lindellians. We had, Lauren was my co-host. We had other people, Liz Loza. We had so many women on that year, and we kind of learned and grew through that first year of Women of Fantasy Football shows, because we learned what to do. We also learned what not to do. We learned that 5 people on a stream is entirely way too many when you're trying to have a guest and talk to them, because everybody has a thought. We learned timing. We learned everything. And so going into the next year, I was like, okay. I told Josh, I was like, I'm going to just go big. Like, I'm going to shoot for the stars. And if I land one, I land one. If not, like, we have other women. And that's not to say that any women that we interviewed in the first year weren't stars, because they are stars in their own right. When I said I was going big, I was going to ESPN. Like, top of my list was Stefania Bell. And I was like, I'll shoot her an email. If it works, it works. Fantastic. If it doesn't, I shot my shot. Like, you'll never know if you don't try. So that happened. And we stepped into advertising. better. We stepped into getting the word out. We stepped into just all kinds of things. And the people in the fantasy football community, aside from our own team, have been so welcoming about women of fantasy football and have been so great about sharing not only in our passion, but sharing women of fantasy football around, that it's kind of, it started small, but that's why I told Josh, I was like, it's not just a once a year thing. It's a movement, because we don't want it to just be, okay, 4 Wednesdays in the fall, and that's all you hear from us the rest of the year. No, we believe that women in fantasy football and women in sports in general is so necessary, and it's so important for women, for girls to know that they can love sports, they can know sports, that they can talk about football, they can talk about whatever they want to, and there's a place for them. Like, it's not just a boys' club. We are trying to break that glass ceiling, and I think we're doing so one tile at a time.
I mean, you're absolutely right. You guys have done so much for women in fantasy football. I know you guys reached out to me when I first started, and I was like, wait, what? It's such an honor. I was like, what are you guys doing? And I mean, you have gotten Stefania Bell and all of these, up and coming content creators who have gone on to do, I mean, amazing, huge things. But you've also done a partnership with Galvanize. If you guys out there don't know, Galvanize is Laura Oakman of Fox Sports. It's her foundation to basically train up women in sports broadcasting, women in sports in general. So I want you to talk about a little bit about the purpose of Galvanize, how you got involved with Laura, and what the partnership that you guys are doing means. Because I remember your tweets when this came out. I mean, everybody was just stoked and jumping from the ceiling. So I want to hear a little bit about that.
So 2021, when I reached out to Stefania Bell, I don't even know how I came about it on Twitter. And so it might have been Josh. It was probably Josh. Josh is responsible for everything I know, basically. And so I was like, okay, let me reach out to Laura as a potential guest for Women of Fantasy Football. So I shot her an email and said, hi, my name is Faith Enes, blah, blah, blah. And so eventually she got back to me and said, I would love to. And I said, fantastic. So we got her on the show. She was talking about Galvanize. She was talking about all of that stuff. It was a fantastic interview because, like you said, the purpose of Galvanize is to kind of promote women in fantasy football, but not promote women in sports media, but not just promote them, to empower them, to give them the tools that they need to feel confident to be able to do the job, to be able to stand there in their own right and have the confidence to be able to hold a conversation with a player, with a coach, with a front office member, any of that. And the tagline for Galvanize, I love. It says, girls compete, women empower. And so it's so true. And so Josh and I looked at that. And if you don't know, Women of Fantasy Football for the last 3 years has had a fundraiser every fall and have raffled off autographed jerseys and memorabilia to raise money. In the first 2 years, we raised money for the Women's Sports Foundation. And after 2021, some things just happened. And I went to Josh and I said, I don't feel like this is the right place for us anymore. Like, I don't feel that relationship is right. So I don't know if it was him or I, but full disclosure, it was probably him who said, what if we partnered with Laura and Galvanize? And I said, I am here for that. I am all for it. So I shot an email to Laura and said, hey, if you have a minute at some point, Josh and I would love to have a conversation with you about partnering with Galvanize and what that would look like. And so in our brain, it was, we raise money, we give the money to Laura for Galvanize, for scholarship, for whatever, for however she wants to do it. But when Laura Oakman says that she's going to partner with somebody, she takes the word partner seriously. She said in our conversation, first of all, Laura Oakman is one of the greatest human beings you will ever meet. She is so down to earth. She is just, in a 20-minute conversation with her, like, you leave the conversation feeling like you can go run through a brick wall. And it may not even have been about anything serious. So she took the word partner and said, okay, we're going to make sure that you get something out of this. It's not just going to be you raise money, you give it to Galvanize, we use it, we say thank you. No, like, we're going to make sure that it works for both of us. So we were really excited to announce that partnership, because not only does it get the name of Galvanize out there, but it gets women of fantasy football to women who may not necessarily play fantasy football. And honestly, you don't have to play fantasy football to be a woman of fantasy football. I know it sounds oxymoronic, but it just, how it started is not the direction that we're going. Yes, we started as women of fantasy football because it's a cool acronym and you can say it, but it's just about women in sports. And so making that partnership with Laura, with Galvanize, there have been names of people who have reached out to women of fantasy football, who have reacted to women of fantasy football, who have responded, who have liked, who have followed. And I'm like, every time I bring a big name to the Club Fantasy Writer Shed about somebody who has followed women of fantasy football or someone who has reached out, they get just as hype as Josh and I do. And I absolutely love it, because not only are they're great, but big names are seeing WOFF. And so if they're seeing it, they're probably talking about it. And that's just mind-blowing to me.
And it's, you mentioned this too. This isn't just about fantasy football. It's about sports in general and empowering women. And think about a few years ago when Cam Newton made that statement, like, to hear a woman talking about running routes is funny, ha, ha, ha. And now we see so many women on the sidelines, in the war room, talking about, draft decisions, on the sidelines, in the fantasy space. Liz Losa is now with ESPN up there talking about fantasy sports. And so I feel like you guys have definitely helped that movement and just expanded it. And you guys have made this a community. So as part of this community, what advice would you give to anybody trying to break into either the industry or the fantasy industry or the sports community in general, from what you've learned in your experience?
So I would say, like, nobody can tell you that you don't have a right to be here, whether you want to do something in the public eye or you want to do something behind the scenes, whether you want to write or be the face of a video or a podcast, or whether you want to video edit or create graphics or edit words. You have just as right to be here as anybody, male, female, whomever. Nobody can't tell you you have a right to be here. So one of the Club Fantasy writers, Zach Berger, also known as FF Chulipa Batman.
Love it.
Recently posted a thread on this subject, and there was a line that he wrote that stuck out to me, and it said, "Get comfortable with being uncomfortable," and I was like, it's so true, but nobody wants to do it because it sucks. And it does. But that's the thing, is you don't grow through comfort. If you are comfortable doing whatever you're currently doing, you're not going to grow. It's the same with if you're working out, trying to grow muscles. It's the same with if you are trying to build something. If you are comfortable, no progress will ever be made because you're just going to keep doing the same thing over and over again. It's not until you decide that you're okay with being uncomfortable, then things start to happen. So
Yeah.
if you are writing and you're not sure, just keep going. You can ask any writer in the fantasy football space, and they will tell you that the first article that they ever wrote is not the article that they ever got recognition for. It's not their first piece that made everybody go, hey, look at this person. They know their fantasy football. Let me talk about that. No. There's probably 30 articles that they have published on their blog somewhere that they read with their mom.
Yeah,
So.
no, exactly. And I think just on a personal level, I need to remind myself to take your advice sometimes because I'm always super afraid of putting myself out there and saying, I don't want to be wrong. I don't want to be wrong. And I think that in this industry, people expect you to be perfect a lot of the time. And if we were perfect, we would all win the $1 million in DraftKings every single week. That's just not how it works. So don't be afraid of being perfect and putting yourself out there. Guys, we're
And
about
I'll say, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to say, guys, if you have any questions for Faith, drop them in the chat because we're almost up against it. And if you have any questions, we would love to get those in before the end of the stream. But I'm sorry, Faith, go ahead.
Oh, no, you're okay. I was just going to say that if you are going to say something, especially on social media, whether it's Twitter, whether it's Facebook, whether it's Instagram, if you have something that you believe in and you have a take, stand by it. If you're going to say it, stand by it. Whatever anybody else says, if they come at you because that's a dumb take, that's a stupid take, you don't know what you're talking about, whatever, stand by it. Because the second you back down, people are going to think that you don't know what you're talking about. Or they're going to look at you as sort of
just wishy-washy.
Correct. But also know that if you post something on social media that is controversial, people will say something. People are going to say it, and you have to either stand by it and say, here's why I believe this. And full disclosure, people are going to give you crap. Ignore it. Because if you don't ignore it, it'll go to your head. It'll go to your heart. You'll start second guessing yourself. You just got to ignore it.
Faith, where were you like last year when I needed this so much? Where were you? I could have used this advice so much last season. But you're absolutely right. I mean, aside from the trolls, aside from, the haters, there's just going to be people who don't disagree with or don't agree with you, pure and simple. But as long as your process is right, as long as you're putting in the work, it's okay to be wrong. It is okay to be wrong. I'm still coming to terms with that myself.
And I was having a discussion with somebody, I don't know. Honestly, creating fantasy football content is nothing but educated guesses. You are making guesses for the upcoming week based on the previous week's performance. And they could repeat that performance, they could exceed that performance, or they could get injured within the first 15 seconds of the game, and now Cooper Kupp is having ankle surgery. Like, it's an educated guess. When somebody makes, again, an educated guess, whether it's an article or on a podcast, whatever, it's up to the individual managers to follow that advice. If you follow that advice, it's your decision. If something goes wrong, it's on you. It's not on the fantasy analyst who told you to do that. They didn't put a gun to your head and tell you to start Cooper Kupp. They didn't, whatever. It's up to you. And it's really frustrating to see people getting mad at fantasy analysts. They're making educated guesses. Nobody's got a magic crystal ball that they can see the future. Because like you said, if we could, we'd all be millionaires. None of us would be slaving away trying to get our names out there and create content because we'd already be rich.
Yeah, exactly. And I would Don't get me wrong. I would love to be rich, but we're rich in experiences at this point,
Yes, we
right?
are
We're
rich in
rich in
life.
experiences. Guys, thank you so much for turning out and tuning in to the inaugural episode of Her Story in the Making. We've about reached the end of our time. But Faith, tell us a little bit more about your work and where people can find you on the Twitter machine, on, all of your other endeavors. The people want to know.
So you can find me on Twitter at FF_leap of faith. You can find Women of Fantasy Football on Twitter at women_of_FF. Follow, if you don't want to follow me, I get it, but follow Women of Fantasy Football. We are constantly sharing things. We have our weekly Sneaky Flex show with Kelly and Dave Fantasy's twin 7-year-old girls. And I mean,
Who are
it's
geniuses.
It's 15 minutes of flex advice from 7-year-olds. Hello. How is it not entertaining? Follow the crew at Club Fantasy FFL at IDP Guys. If you want to see my work, read an IDP Guys article because it was probably touched by me at some point. It's touched by my creative editing. That sounds better.
Your editing's wonderful.
And if you create content, if you write content and you have an editor, thank your editors, because the pieces that get submitted and the pieces that people read are usually not identical. The words are the same, but there's a lot of work that goes from point A to point B.
Exactly.
I'm just saying.
Exactly. A good editor, even some of the best novelists. I have so many Stephen King books behind me. Stephen King has a lot to thank his editor for, let me tell you. And so do the people in the fantasy industry. Faith, again, thank you so much. Guys, everybody watching, thank you so much for tuning in. This will be a bi-weekly show going forward, so check us out, not the week of Thanksgiving, but the week after at the same time, same channel. And if you guys have any questions to ask our guests, please feel free to post them in Twitter, in the chat going forward. We love to get your questions. We love to enlighten the community. And again, just thank you so much for joining us. And Faith, do you have any parting words?
I don't.
Yeah, let's. She summed it up. It's perfect. All right, guys, we're going to go. Thank you so much. And check us out again in 2 weeks at the same time. Cheers, guys.
Bye.
Oh, sorry. This is not good.